The sun climbs over the Tigris, dragging long, jagged shadows across the mud-brick ruins of Ashur. 3 millennia have passed, yet the silence here feels heavy, as if the earth itself remembers the heat of the forge. This was not a land of easy inheritance. It was a crucible, hemmed in by towering, unforgiving mountains and surrounded by hostile borders. The people here faced a singular choice: adapt or vanish. They began as merchants, men who navigated the treacherous paths of Anatolia to trade tin and textiles. They measured their success in weights and measures, building the economic spine that would later sustain a war machine. But the landscape demanded more than trade. It demanded grit. Every mile of road, every caravan route, was a struggle against the elements and the encroaching reach of rivals. They learned to read the horizon for threats long before they learned to command it. The transition from the plow to the spear was not a sudden shift, but a slow, grinding necessity. They were a people forged in the fires of survival. By 1400 BC, the merchant caravans had long since ceased their primary focus on trade. The plow was set aside, left to rust in the fields, replaced by the weight of the spear. The shift was fueled by a discovery that changed the geometry of the battlefield: iron. While their rivals clung to the brittle, soft edges of bronze, the Assyrian smiths mastered the furnace. They hammered raw ore into blades that held their edge through the brutal friction of combat. When these blades met bronze, the enemy weapons shattered, leaving opponents defenseless. This was not merely a matter of better tools. It was a total restructuring of power. They abandoned the tradition of the seasonal militia, where farmers fought only between harvests. Instead, they forged the first professional standing army. Men were trained to march in lockstep, their movements synchronized by a command structure that turned individual soldiers into a single kinetic force. They drilled on the plains until the dust rose in uniform clouds. They learned to hold lines under pressure and execute maneuvers that turned the chaos of the battlefield into a predictable, mechanical slaughter. The era of the amateur had ended. A new, disciplined machine had arrived, and it was ready to expand. The open battlefield was no longer enough. The Assyrian command turned their focus to the high, stone walls that had protected their neighbors for centuries. They engineered a new kind of terror. Massive wooden towers, taller than the ramparts they targeted, were rolled toward the gates on heavy, reinforced wheels. These structures were not just platforms. They were mobile fortresses that allowed soldiers to rain projectiles down upon the defenders from above. Below the towers, the ground shook under the weight of the iron-tipped rams. These were not simple battering devices, but complex machines suspended in heavy frames, designed to concentrate immense kinetic energy against a single point of masonry. The sound of the rams striking stone became the final note for many cities. With rhythmic, mechanical precision, the iron heads bit into the mortar, cracking the foundations that had stood for generations. Walls that were once considered impenetrable crumbled into dust under the relentless, systematic assault. As the stone gave way, the army poured through the breaches, turning the defense into a rout. This was the new reality of warfare. No fortification could withstand the combination of height, force, and engineering. The terror did not always arrive on the tip of a spear. Often, it arrived in the form of a single, silent envoy standing before the city gates. Under the direction of kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, the empire had mastered the art of the ultimatum. The envoy would present a scroll, his presence a chilling reminder of the iron machines that had already leveled the surrounding provinces. He spoke of the inevitable. Surrender meant survival, but defiance meant the erasure of the city from the map. The threat was not vague. It was a detailed, systematic promise of destruction. He described the fire that would consume the granaries, the iron-tipped rams that would turn the defensive walls into rubble, and the fate of those who chose to resist. The silence that followed his words was heavy, thick with the realization that the empire now stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. As the envoys turned and walked away, the defenders were left to weigh their pride against the terrifying, calculated efficiency of an empire. The focus of the empire shifted from the blood-soaked plains to the heart of Nineveh. Here, the wealth extracted from 1,000 conquered cities was poured into stone and mortar. Sennacherib transformed the capital into a monument of absolute authority. Massive gateways rose from the earth, flanked by colossal winged bulls carved from single blocks of limestone. These guardians stood as silent, imposing sentinels, their eyes fixed on every visitor who dared approach the palace threshold. Inside the vast halls, the walls became a narrative of power. Intricate reliefs stretched across the stone surfaces, capturing the raw intensity of the hunt and the calculated precision of the campaign. Every chisel mark served a purpose. The stone depicted the king driving chariots through broken terrain and the systematic movement of troops across distant borders. These were not merely decorations. They were propaganda etched in rock, designed to overwhelm the senses of any diplomat or subject who entered the royal presence. The scale of the architecture was intended to make the individual feel small, a deliberate echo of the empire's reach. Gold leaf caught the light in the inner chambers, while the sheer height of the vaulted ceilings dwarfed the human form. This was the physical manifestation of a superpower, a place where the history of the world was rewritten to serve the glory of the throne. The city stood as a testament to a civilization that had mastered both the sword and the stone. The true ambition of the empire eventually moved beyond the limits of stone and conquest. Ashurbanipal recognized that an empire of iron would eventually rust, but an empire of knowledge could endure. He turned his attention to the clay tablets scattered across the Near East. He commanded his scribes to scour every corner of the known world, seeking out the fragments of ancient wisdom. They traveled to distant cities, copying texts, cataloging myths, and hauling thousands of clay tablets back to the heart of Nineveh. This was a systematic campaign of collection, as disciplined as any military march. Inside the royal library, the air smelled of sun-baked mud and dust. Scribes worked in rows, their styluses pressing precise wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. They transcribed the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserving the ancient search for immortality, alongside astronomical charts, medical texts, and legal codes. Every tablet was indexed, a testament to a civilization that sought to own the past, as thoroughly as it owned the land. It was a quiet, deliberate act of defiance against the passage of time, creating a permanent record that would outlast the very empire that built it. The silence of the library was shattered by the thunder of a coalition. Babylonians, Medes, and Persians converged on the horizon like a rising tide. The walls of Nineveh, once considered impenetrable, faced a force that had learned the lessons of Assyrian warfare too well. Siege engines hammered the gates, the rhythm of iron against stone echoing across the plains. Dust choked the air as the massive fortifications began to buckle. Defenders scrambled along the battlements, but the weight of the coalition proved insurmountable. A breach opened in the northern wall, and the tide poured through. The systematic destruction began immediately. Torches were cast into the wooden structures, and the fire spread with terrifying speed. The heat intensified, turning the grand halls into furnaces. Stone reliefs cracked and crumbled as the roofs collapsed inward, burying the archives. The city that had held the world in its grip for centuries was reduced to ash in a matter of days. Smoke billowed into the sky, a dark shroud. The era of iron and stone ended in the roar of a collapsing empire, leaving only embers where the heart of the world once beat. The fire eventually starved, leaving behind a landscape of blackened stone and cooling ash. Where once the air vibrated with the rhythmic march of soldiers and the grinding of siege engines, there was now only the sound of shifting debris. The heat dissipated, leaving the ruins exposed to the harsh, dry sun of the Tigris Valley. Great gates, once the threshold of a world-spanning power, stood jagged and hollow against the horizon. Dust settled into the deep carvings of the walls, filling the eyes of the winged bulls and softening the sharp edges of the reliefs. The coalition forces moved on, leaving the city to the slow reclamation of the earth. Time began its work, stripping away the remnants of the imperial glory. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracked masonry and carrying away the fine grit of the pulverized city. There was no movement here, no shouting, no command. Only the steady, patient erosion of the desert. The silence was absolute. The mounds of Ashur are not merely graves of a fallen people. They are the foundation of the modern world. The Assyrians were the first to grasp the cold, hard logic of the imperial state. They proved that a superpower is not built on luck, but on the precise integration of logistics, force, and information. They created the professional military, a machine that operated independently of the harvest or the season, setting a standard that every nation-state has since mimicked. They mastered the art of administrative control, forging a bureaucracy that could project power across vast, hostile distances. Even their obsession with the written word, the systematic gathering of knowledge into a central archive, remains the primary directive of every major power that seeks to define its own history. The iron blades have long since rusted, and the stone walls have crumbled into the river silt, but the blueprint survived. It is present in the mobilization of modern armies, the reach of global intelligence networks, and the relentless drive to document. The wind still whistles through the gates, but the lessons of their rise and fall remain the silent, guiding architecture of every power today.